In the serene academic world of Glenwood University, a secret affair is discovered, one that will shake the institution and leave a community reeling. On a chilly March morning in 2011, Professor Thomas Baldwin, a well-respected lecturer in psychology, was found dead in his office. The discovery of his affair with a transgender student, now fully revealed in the days following his death, alarmed everyone who heard the tale, especially through the university and the town. But this wasn't just a scandal, it was murder. Emmanuela Evans, formerly Emmanuelle, had always felt like an outsider, even in her own skin. Born in 1989, she grew up in a small, conservative town in Mississippi. By the time she was 13, she knew something was wrong, but it was hard to pinpoint what it was. Emmanuel's days were spent trapped in a body that felt like a prison, surrounded by people who could never understand. His family, deeply religious, often reinforced traditional gender roles, and there was no space for questions or discussions about identity. Emmanuel struggled through high school, excelling academically, but feeling isolated. In 2007, he applied to Glenwood University, an escape from the oppressive environment of home. Once at Glenwood, Emmanuel could begin exploring the feelings he had kept bottled up for so long. It was in the fall of 2010 that Emmanuel, at 21, started the process of transitioning into Emmanuela. It was a difficult journey. Her family disowned her when she came out as transgender in early 2011. Her father never responded to her letters, and her mother's only call after the news was filled with harsh judgment. Emmanuela was left to navigate this painful period alone, without support from those she once considered family. Glenwood University became Emmanuela's refuge. The liberal environment allowed her to embrace her true identity. But the experience was far from perfect. While a few professors and students supported her, whispers followed her in hallways. The stares were hard to ignore, and the isolation was just as real. She threw herself into her studies, majoring in psychology, hoping to understand herself and the turmoil she faced. It was during this time she met Professor Thomas Baldwin. Baldwin had a reputation as a brilliant academic, someone who could inspire students with his knowledge. He was well known in the psychology department, having published several papers on cognitive therapy and emotional trauma. On the surface, he appeared the perfect mentor for Emmanuela, someone who might help her navigate the complexities of her identity. At first, the relationship between them was professional. Baldwin seemed to understand Emmanuela in ways others didn't. He was patient, providing guidance and reassurance as she discussed her emotional struggles. But as the weeks passed, their relationship shifted. Baldwin, a man in his late 40s, began to take a personal interest in Emmanuela's transformation. What started as mentorship soon blurred into something darker. Baldwin had an uncanny ability to make Emmanuela feel seen, accepted even, in her new identity as a woman. He told her that she was brave, that she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. Emmanuela, starved for affection and affirmation, clung to his words. By January 2011, their relationship had evolved into a secret affair. Baldwin's attention came with strings attached. He insisted that their relationship remain hidden, constantly reminding Emmanuela that the world was not ready to accept her, and certainly not their relationship. He fed off her vulnerability, using her insecurity as a tool to control her. Emmanuela, in her fragile state, accepted his terms. She believed this relationship was her only connection to love and acceptance. March 6, 2011. By this date, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Baldwin's demands and secrecy had become suffocating. The love Emmanuela once thought she found had transformed into manipulation. Baldwin kept promising her that things would be different, but only if they kept the affair hidden. He assured her that his position as a professor and the world's judgment of her transgender identity would ruin them both if the truth came out. These promises and threats haunted Emmanuela, making her question her worth and her future. It was this internal battle that consumed her thoughts as she sat in his office on March 5, 2011, for what was supposed to be a routine meeting. The conversation was tense, and while no words were directly exchanged about ending the relationship, the undertones were clear. Emmanuela sensed Baldwin pulling away from her emotionally, as if he had extracted all he wanted from her vulnerability. He was no longer the supportive figure he once pretended to be. As she left his office that night, the weight of the situation bore down on her shoulders. The affair wasn't just about love or desire anymore. It had become a weapon of control, a way for Baldwin to maintain dominance over her fragile sense of self. Everything exploded on March 8, 2011. After Baldwin's body was discovered in his office, the police immediately turned their attention to Emmanuela. She was the last known person to have seen him alive. Detectives questioned her, probing into her connection with Baldwin. Emmanuela admitted that she had been with him the day before the murder, for tutoring, she explained. But she left out the most crucial detail: their affair. She knew that once it was revealed, it would change everything. As detectives dug deeper, more of Emmanuela's history came to light. The investigation exposed how Emmanuel, the young man who never felt comfortable in his own body, had transitioned into Emmanuela, the woman struggling for acceptance in a world not ready to embrace her. The police uncovered how her family had abandoned her and how Baldwin had preyed on her vulnerability. Despite her growing anxiety, Emmanuela maintained her innocence. She did not murder Baldwin, she insisted, but her involvement in his life was undeniable. March 12, 2011. By this date, Baldwin's affair with Emmanuela had been leaked to the press. The public reaction was swift and brutal. The media quickly latched onto the scandal, focusing more on Emmanuela's transgender identity than on Baldwin's abuse of power. Every headline made her out to be an outcast, a scandalous figure who had led a respected professor astray. Baldwin's reputation crumbled as details of his double life emerged. He had been a devoted father and husband by day, yet in secret he manipulated his student for months, all while keeping her true identity hidden. For Emmanuela, the backlash was immediate and intense. She began receiving hate mail, and her dorm room was vandalized with transphobic messages. Threats poured in through every channel, accusing her of destroying Baldwin's career and life. The pressure was unbearable. No one seemed to care about the pain she had endured or how Baldwin had used her insecurities to control her. Instead, they saw her as the villain in the story, the transgender student who ruined a respected man. By mid-March, Emmanuela's life had become a living nightmare. The scrutiny followed her everywhere. People whispered as she passed by, and some openly insulted her in the halls. What had once been a sanctuary Glenwood University now felt like a prison, with Emmanuela trapped under the weight of her own secrets and Baldwin's betrayal. The imbalance of power in their relationship became a focal point for the investigators. Baldwin had used Emmanuela's identity against her, creating a toxic dynamic in which she felt powerless. Even in death, Baldwin's control over Emmanuela persisted, as the world chose to blame her rather than see her as the victim of a predatory relationship. As the days passed, the tension only increased, with more revelations about Baldwin's life surfacing. But in all of this, Emmanuela was left to face the consequences alone, vilified and persecuted for simply being herself in a world that refused to accept her. Between March 6th and March 20th, the police worked tirelessly, unraveling the twisted connections in Thomas Baldwin's life. His murder had shocked the university and the town, but the layers of deceit and hidden affairs that were beginning to surface added to the mystery. Baldwin had lived a double life for months, and now that he was dead, the consequences of his actions began to seep through every corner of his existence. On March 15th, 2011, Baldwin's wife, Martha, was brought in for questioning. Martha had been a respected figure in the community, known for her involvement in charitable work and as the devoted wife of Professor Baldwin. But behind the polished exterior, there was something deeper, something colder. For years, Martha had played her role as the perfect spouse, supporting her husband's career and taking care of their home. Yet beneath the surface, the marriage had been crumbling for a long time. Martha Ray had noticed subtle changes in Baldwin's behavior during the months leading up to his death. He had grown more distant, staying late at the university, claiming he was mentoring students or caught up in administrative duties. She didn't believe his excuses, but chose to ignore them. She knew something was wrong. She had seen the way he looked at his phone, the secret smiles he tried to hide. But Martha had learned over the years how to bury her resentment. Their marriage, on paper, was a success, and the last thing she wanted was to disrupt the image of their perfect life. There had been whispers in the faculty lounge, subtle comments about Baldwin's close mentorship of certain students. But Martha had trained herself not to ask questions. By the time detectives questioned her on March 15th, Martha was seething with rage. She had found out about the affair after Baldwin's death. Her husband had been involved with one of his students, a transgender woman named Emmanuela. The betrayal cut deep, and the shame even deeper. Martha had always been the one in control, the one who maintained the order of their household. Now she was a widow, but worse, she was a widow whose husband had been unfaithful, and it was all unraveling before her. During the interview, Martha's coldness was apparent. She denied any knowledge of the murder, insisting that she had no idea about Baldwin's relationship with Emmanuela until after the police investigation began. But her voice betrayed her. The tension was clear, and her composed facade cracked under the weight of years of repressed anger. Martha had known something was wrong, but she had kept quiet. Now, she was being forced to confront the reality of her husband's deceit. As the investigation continued, detectives found small, subtle clues that Martha had been more aware of her husband's affair than she was letting on. She had kept silent for months, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But Baldwin's murder brought everything to the surface, leaving Martha to deal with the public humiliation of being the wife of a man who had lived a secret life. By March 20th, 2011, the investigation was closing in on Emmanuela again. Detectives had found enough evidence to warrant a second round of questioning. They had discovered text messages exchanged between Emmanuela and Baldwin on the night of the murder. The messages painted a clear picture of their relationship's final hours. Baldwin had been growing distant, pulling away from Emmanuela emotionally, and the texts revealed the tension between them. The messages were accusatory, full of frustration and anger from both sides. Emmanuela had confronted Baldwin about his refusal to acknowledge their relationship publicly. She felt used, hidden away like a dirty secret. Baldwin, on the other hand, was desperate to keep his reputation intact, especially since Emmanuela's transition had made the affair more complicated than he had anticipated. He told her that their relationship couldn't continue. Not because he didn't care, but because the stakes were too high. Emmanuela felt heartbroken and betrayed, but Baldwin was more concerned with protecting himself. When Emmanuela was questioned again, she admitted her anger. She had spent months feeling like she was finally becoming her true self, only to be dragged into a secret that made her feel more invisible than ever before. She told detectives how Baldwin had promised her love and support, but only in private. In public, she was nothing more than his student. Her frustration had reached a boiling point that night, but she insisted she had left his office without harming him. Detectives probed further, asking her about her emotional state and the nature of the confrontation. Emmanuela's responses were raw, tinged with the pain of someone who had been manipulated and discarded. She had entered the relationship hoping for acceptance, but Baldwin had only reinforced her feelings of inadequacy. In her own words, she had felt like she would always be the one hidden in the shadows, never acknowledged for who she truly was. On March 25, 2011, a shocking twist in the investigation came to light. A fellow student, Emma, approached the police with information. Emma had overheard a heated phone call between Baldwin and Emmanuela just days before the murder. In the call, Baldwin had threatened to expose Emmanuela if she didn't agree to end their relationship quietly. Baldwin knew that if their affair became public, his career and personal life would be destroyed. But he also knew the damage it would do to Emmanuela. Being transgender, she was already vulnerable, and public exposure would lead to harassment and isolation. Emma's revelation added a new layer to the case. Baldwin had been holding the affair over Emmanuela's head, using it as leverage to control her. It became clear that Baldwin had never truly cared for Emmanuela's well-being. He had seen her transition as something to exploit, something he could use to fulfill his own desires while keeping her dependent on his approval. The phone call Emma overheard revealed just how toxic their relationship had become, with Baldwin willing to ruin Emmanuela's life to protect his own. On March 28, 2011, the final blow to the investigation came when the university received an anonymous email. The email contained photos of Baldwin and Emmanuela together, further solidifying the evidence of their affair. The photos were intimate, clearly taken during private moments. The fact that someone had these photos and had waited until this moment to release them only deepened the mystery. Was the email sent by someone close to Baldwin? Someone who had been watching their relationship unfold? With the photos now public, the once sympathetic view of Emmanuela began to shift. The media, which had initially focused on Baldwin's manipulation, and control, now turned their attention to Emmanuela's role in the affair. Rumors began to spread, and public opinion grew divided. Some saw Emmanuela as a victim, exploited by a powerful man. Others viewed her as a willing participant, someone who had knowingly entered into an affair and was now facing the consequences. The scrutiny surrounding Emmanuela intensified, with the public and the university community placing her under a harsh microscope. The investigation had revealed a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. Baldwin's murder had exposed the dark secrets of his life, but it had also left Emmanuela vulnerable to the judgment of a society that wasn't ready to accept her. Each new piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the toxic relationship between Baldwin and Emmanuela, but it also left more questions in its wake. As the case moved toward trial, both Baldwin's legacy and Emmanuela's future hung in the balance, leaving the public to wonder how far someone would go to protect their secrets. By April 10, 2011, the investigation had built up so much momentum that it seemed inevitable when detectives finally arrested Emmanuela. The news spread quickly. Emmanuela, the transgender student who had been involved with Professor Baldwin, was now the prime suspect in his murder. The university was abuzz with gossip, and the local media seized the story, turning it into a sensationalized event. Headlines painted Emmanuela as a troubled and obsessive student who couldn't handle the rejection of her older, more experienced lover. What truly shocked the community was the discovery that Emmanuela's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. This shattered her alibi and destroyed any hope she had of clearing her name. The knife used to kill Baldwin, once thought to be an untraceable clue, now became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. As soon as the fingerprint results came back, Emmanuela was taken into custody, and the wheels of the justice system began to turn. Emmanuela, whose life had already been riddled with rejection and pain, now faced the full weight of the legal system. The arrest was more than just a moment of accusation. It was the culmination of years of struggle. From the moment Emmanuel realized he was not comfortable in his body, life had been an uphill battle. Transitioning to Emmanuela had given her a brief period of hope, but now, standing accused of murder, it seemed like her world had collapsed once again. Her family's rejection after coming out as transgender had been one of the deepest wounds in her life, a wound that never truly healed. The distance from her family created a void that Baldwin had filled, at least for a time. Baldwin had appeared to be a savior, someone who understood her, accepted her as she was, and offered her the validation she had been craving. But that validation came at a price. Baldwin's acceptance turned out to be a mask. He had preyed on Emmanuela's vulnerability, luring her into a secretive and controlling relationship. Emmanuela had been starved for love and acceptance, and Baldwin manipulated her into believing he could provide that. Yet the secrecy and shame he imposed on their relationship made Emmanuela feel like she was still hiding, still trapped in the body of the man she was trying to leave behind. Each time Baldwin refused to acknowledge their relationship publicly, it deepened Emmanuela's sense of invisibility, leaving her feeling like she would never be seen for who she truly was. As Emmanuela sat in a cold jail cell awaiting trial, the emotional weight of her life hung over her. She was no longer the hopeful psychology student trying to build a new life. She was a murder suspect with the entire world looking at her through a lens of judgment and bias. The media focused heavily on her transgender identity, amplifying the scrutiny she already faced. What was once a private struggle had now become a public spectacle, with every detail of her personal life being dissected by strangers. By May 15, 2012, the trial became a media circus, a stage for both the prosecution and defense to spin their versions of the truth. The prosecution wasted no time painting Emmanuela as a mentally unstable, obsessive student who had been driven to murder out of jealousy and rage. They pointed to her text messages with Baldwin on the night of the murder, portraying her as a woman scorned, unable to accept that Baldwin had wanted to end the affair. They described her transition as a period of mental instability, exploiting society's lack of understanding about the complexities of being transgender. The defense, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to humanize Emmanuela, focusing on her tragic background. They spoke of her early life as Emmanuel, the child who never felt right in his own skin. The defense carefully laid out how Emmanuela's transition had been a courageous attempt to live authentically, despite her family's rejection. The courtroom heard how Baldwin had come into her life at a vulnerable moment, offering her what seemed like love. But in reality, he had only manipulated her for his own purposes. The prosecution's arguments, however, were damning. They presented the knife, with Emmanuela's fingerprints, as undeniable proof. They showed the text messages between Baldwin and Emmanuela, highlighting the tension that had built up in the final days of their relationship. The affair, once secret, had become a time bomb, and they argued that Emmanuela's fragile emotional state had led her to kill Baldwin in a fit of rage when he tried to end things. The emotional toll on Emmanuela during the trial was immense. As the court revisited the details of her life, it was as if her entire existence was being judged, not just her actions on the night of the murder. Every aspect of her identity, her transition, her relationship with Baldwin, and even her emotional state were scrutinized in front of a jury that, for the most part, didn't understand what it meant to be transgender. They saw her as an outsider, someone different, and that difference made it easier to paint her as the villain in Baldwin's tragic story. On May 15, 2012, the trial reached its conclusion. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Emmanuela was found responsible for the murder of Thomas Baldwin. But there was no satisfaction in the decision, no clear sense of justice. The courtroom remained divided. Some saw Baldwin as the true villain, a man who had taken advantage of a vulnerable student, only to meet a tragic end when his manipulations were exposed. Others believed that Emmanuela, unable to control her emotions, had acted out of jealousy and anger, killing the man she couldn't have. For many, the verdict felt incomplete. Emmanuela was the one going to prison, but there was a sense that the true story had been lost amid the headlines and courtroom drama. The people who knew Emmanuela, who understood her struggle, saw her as a tragic figure, manipulated by a man who exploited her need for love and acceptance. Yet, it was Emmanuela who faced life behind bars, while Baldwin's legacy remained tangled in the mess he had left behind. As Emmanuela was led away in handcuffs, the questions hung in the air, questions that would never be answered. Did she kill Baldwin in cold blood, Or had Baldwin's manipulation driven her to the edge? Could it have ended differently if Baldwin had treated her with the respect she deserved? Or if society had accepted Emmanuela for who she was from the beginning? The story ended not with justice, but with a sense of unease. The courtroom had handed down a guilty verdict, but the real villain was still up for debate. Emmanuela's fate was sealed, but the community remained divided, torn between sympathy for her struggle and outrage over the murder. Baldwin's death had exposed deep wounds, not just in Emmanuela's life, but in the society that had failed to support her. And as she was taken away to begin her sentence, everyone was left wondering what might have happened if Emmanuela had been accepted for who she was from the start. What if her story had been one of love and support instead of secrecy and shame? The trial had ended, but the true tragedy lay in what could have been. We have a very similar case, the case of the housewife whose affair with pastor's teenage son ends deadly. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily cases.